I saw these clips of ICE going in and just fucking ripping these people out of their homes, and mothers and grandmothers and children screaming, no warrant. If fellow U.S. citizens are like, what are you doing? They like intimidate them, fucking arrest them and shit. This is like Gestapo type of stuff. And it just blows my mind that there's a certain ugly segment of the American population that's enjoying watching these families getting ripped out of their homes. And you somehow think that America is going to be better if this is done. Like, so what? So they took those people out. They're taking these brown people out that are living week to week. And somehow you feel like if they get them out of the country, your boss who's not paying you a living wage will suddenly start paying you a living wage.
You just heard from comedian Bill Burr, who expressed frustration with the Americans currently cheering on ICE's Gestapo-like raids, and I think that he speaks for a lot of people. But even though a sizable portion of the population is undoubtedly enjoying the cruelty that they're seeing, even the Americans who once supported Donald Trump's immigration agenda are starting to have second thoughts. And I say this because polls like this one from ABC and Ipsos show that a majority of Americans think that Donald Trump is taking things way too far, and for good reason. We've seen 20 ICE agents in Oklahoma City raid the home of a mother and her 3 daughters, and even though the person that they were looking for had moved out of that residence, they didn't listen to the mom explain that and just chose to seize all of their electronics as well as their life savings anyway. On top of that, ICE is deporting immigrants charged with crimes before they're even able to stand trial, so they're not able to get their day in court. And they've also been waiting outside of courts to arrest immigrants who do get their day in court after their cases have been dismissed. This has been happening across the country from New York to Arizona, and this video from Breakthrough News shows masked ICE agents kidnapping a family, including a little girl and her mother, while they were leaving court, and they're increasingly ramping up detentions of non-criminal immigrants like Ksenia Petrova, a Russian scientist from Harvard who's been detained for 3 months despite not committing any crimes, and there are countless other examples. So even though Americans voted for mass deportation, some of them very clearly don't like what mass deportation looks like in practice, because obviously seeing men in masks abduct people and throw them into unmarked vehicles feels a little bit too Hitlerian, even for Americans, which is why more and more people are comparing ICE to Gestapo. Bill Burr did it, as you heard, and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz also made that same comparison during his commencement speech at the University of Minnesota. And we're going to come back to Bill Burr, who has more to say, but I do want to share Walz's comments with you because he concisely contextualizes the horrors that Bill Burr is reacting to, and I think it's important.
Donald Trump's modern-day Gestapo is scooping folks up off the streets. They're in unmarked vans, wearing masks, being shipped off to foreign torture dungeons. No chance to mount a defense, not even a chance to kiss a loved one goodbye, just grabbed up by masked agents, shoved into those vans, and disappeared. To be clear, there's no way for us to know whether they were actually criminals or not, because they refused to give them a trial. We're supposed to just take their word for it. And when duly elected members of Congress tried to exercise their constitutional right of oversight at an ICE facility, they get shoved around and threatened with arrest. And when courts told them repeatedly to knock it off, they brazenly defy them. Meanwhile, we have an aspiring fascist in Stephen Miller on TV talking about suspending habeas corpus. All of you know this. That's only used in times of rebellion or emergency, neither of which is happening right now. By the way, they're not only kicking out folks who are undocumented here, they're kicking out citizens. A few weeks ago, they kicked out 3 children, all under 8 years old. One of them had brain cancer, for Christ's sakes. It's not hyperbole to say we're not far from a world where anyone could get that knock at a door. And there's no guarantee you'd get your day in court or that you'd ever make it home alive from whatever corner of the world they stick you in.
And that right there is the key. Even if you are heartless enough to not care at all about what's happening to immigrants, documented and undocumented alike, you should care at least for self-serving reasons, because the lack of due process isn't just a threat to immigrants, it is a threat to all of us. This is something that judges are also warning about, as Politico reports, because if the government doesn't have to prove that someone is guilty before punishing them, all bets are off. They can say anything about anyone to legally justify our imprisonment. I mean, respect for the rule of law is what separates democracies from autocratic regimes. And that's what Bill Burr also talked about in the same episode.
And I got to tell you, these fucking people that are just watching this stuff, and you don't think that eventually, if you just co-sign on an agency being able to do that, just barge into somebody's fucking house like that, just start lining people up, asking questions, no warrants, just total intimidation, right? If you're signing off on that, you have to understand, do you really think that that's just going to stop there?
And I'm so glad that he made this point, because even if you're one of the sick, sadistic fucks taking pleasure in these human rights abuses, the loss of due process and habeas corpus does not bode well for any of us, including the people cheerleading this effort right now. And if they're coming for immigrants today, they're going to come for citizens tomorrow. They're already detaining and questioning critics of the Trump administration like Hassan Piker. And even though he was released after a couple of hours, they're very clearly trying to send a message to all of Trump's critics. But to Bill Burr's point, there is a portion of the population that's totally cool with the ramifications of authoritarianism so long as they get to watch immigrants suffer, which is diabolical. And I don't know what size of the population likes watching this, but they exist, and that's something that we have to address as a society. But there's also a different portion of the population who wasn't necessarily motivated purely by racism and xenophobia. Rather, their racist and xenophobic inclinations were preyed upon, and they ended up getting duped in some ways into thinking that immigrants and other minority groups were responsible solely for their economic conditions. And that right there is where Bill Burr really shines in this episode, because he explains perfectly how this kind of scapegoating is used by elites to wage class warfare. And he also breaks the news to these people who fell for this that their wages aren't suddenly going to get better or go up after all the immigrants are gone. And the way he says it is very on brand for Bill Burr, but just watch.
What would be a great thing is if everybody read up on the history of these fucking assholes that have run these companies. They have not wanted to pay Americans a living wage ever. They've never wanted to pay us a living wage. And the only reason why they do is because there's laws. And the only reason why there is laws is because people died during protests to start unions. And these fucking psychos that run these companies didn't want to pay a living wage. And eventually they took their factories out of the country so they could go back to not paying a living wage in the form of sweatshop labor. And now they're eventually working their way towards this. The same billionaires that didn't want to pay in the 1800s, way back to the feudal system, they've never wanted to pay you. They don't want to fucking pay you. And they just keep blaming people that don't look like you, that don't have any money or any sort of control over your life. And my people keep believing it. It's unfucking believable. Immigrants are not the reason why you can't make your rent. You can't make your rent because the guy that fucking employs you is not paying you enough money. He's not keeping up, or she's not keeping up with the rate of inflation. The sad fucking thing is there's enough money, there's enough food, there's enough shelter for everybody. But these super rich cunts want too much for themselves. And they're heartless. They don't give a fuck. And when you start to tell them, hey, you're not paying us enough money, they go, oh, look at those fucking brown people over there. If we could just get them to stop jumping over a wall or get them out of their houses. If we could tear apart their families without a warrant, then I would somehow magically start paying you enough money where you could live comfortably and have health insurance. Let's say they got all the illegal immigrants out of this country. That work still has to be done. So now who's doing that work? And what is the rich guy doing? Do you think he's going to pay American citizen wages? Is he going to let one nickel roll out of his pocket? Has that been your experience watching these super rich people? Just out of curiosity. Anyway, it's tragic. This is just a really mean, ugly, I can't even say period, I guess exposure, that it's just brought all of these super fucking overtly racist nationalist psychos to the forefront. It's even happening in like stand-up comedy. It's like it's fucking wild. You know? I don't understand. Who knew? Who knew that there was this many fucking people out there that felt oppressed if they couldn't be this fucking hateful?
What he said there was spot on, just absolutely perfect. Now, having said that, not everything can be reduced down to economics. Sometimes it's just pure racism. But when you step back and you look at how the material conditions for Americans have worsened over time, it's not shocking to see them regress on social issues because this thing always happens, right? This goes back to the classic distinction between materialism and post-materialism. See, developing countries are obviously lagging behind the developed world when it comes to social justice causes, and that's because citizens in these countries, they prioritize their physical and material well-being, security, housing, food, over social justice causes. But once those countries begin to develop to the point where people's basic material needs are met, their politics changes and they start to shift towards a more post-material ideology where they focus on women's rights and LGBTQ plus rights and other civil rights issues as well as civil liberties issues. And there's a number of reasons for this, but the issues that were once secondary to them, they take the forefront once they're able to just survive. That's really important. It doesn't mean that everybody suddenly becomes woke per se once their material needs are met. But I mean, if you're a gay man, for example, in one of these countries, simply surviving a civil war or having access to clean drinking water is going to be more salient to you than equality. Because you can survive as an unequal gay man, but you can't survive without food or water, regardless if you're gay or straight. So there's not going to be much movement towards progress until those material necessities are met. Now, research in my book shows that that's actually starting to change thanks to the internet, but more or less, these differences still hold true in most countries. China is currently shifting to post-materialism as their standard of living improves, whereas in the United States, the opposite is happening. We've made tremendous progress towards social justice following the New Deal, but as jobs were sent overseas and income inequality got worse, Americans reoriented themselves back to a materialist ideology and post-materialism took a backseat. And now we're backsliding as a result. Women have lost the right to bodily autonomy. Opinions on LGBTQ plus people have started to sour after reaching peak highs because Americans are concerned about their own security, their material well-being, and whether or not they're going to be able to pay rent and put food on the table. So the post-material issues take a back seat like they do in developing countries. And in this context, it's very easy for opportunists to frame material and post-material issues as mutually exclusive. And people begin to start to think that, oh, well, the focus on social justice, that's why we haven't made any progress on material issues. And they start to think, well, why should I care about gay rights when I'm one missed paycheck away from sleeping in my car? I don't care about gay people. I don't know any gay people, so why should I care about their liberation? And this climate is ripe for the class warfare that Bill Burr is describing here, because rather than looking at the specific ways elites captured our government to line their pockets at our expense, Americans tend to fall for simpler explanations like, hey, immigrants did it. Women in the workforce, that's why, you can't get a job because the women are taking all the jobs. If they actually understood how the ruling class systematically commodified our entire political process over decades just so they can transfer wealth from the poorest Americans to them, Americans would obviously be furious with the ruling class. I mean, they're only now starting to see it because it's so in your face. Actions from individuals like Elon Musk, as well as other billionaires, is kind of putting late-stage capitalism front and center, so now you can't not notice it. And this makes the divisive scapegoat politics even more essential, right? Because if people really saw our system for what it was, something that is just a game that oligarchs play at our expense, perhaps they'd team up with other workers in the same predicament and fight these bastards. But since class consciousness endangers the ruling class, the elites try to do everything in their power to combat it with divisive politics in order to get working class people to blame each other for their misery. I mean, we see how they blame immigrants for taking jobs and whatnot, but it also happens on a much more insidious, small-scale level. I mean, I remember seeing a meme on Facebook that my former coworker shared of two side-by-side images of refrigerators. One was fully stocked and the other was empty. And the fully stocked fridge had the caption that said, "This is the fridge of a person on welfare." And then the caption above the empty fridge said, "This is the refrigerator of somebody working 40 hours a week." In other words, Americans have become brainwashed by capitalists into blaming each other for their economic woes. It's not the owner of the company that you work for who hasn't given you a raise in years, even though you have more responsibility now than when you started, since you took on the job of your coworkers who were laid off. It's the people worse off than you, the poor welfare recipient who's keeping you down, not your boss, since, your tax dollars are paying for them to apparently sit on their asses and eat like kings and queens, apparently. Like, this is one of many anti-poor tropes that have been disseminated as memes. Like, it's just ingrained in our culture because our culture is deeply capitalist, because we've all been brainwashed at very young ages. So I say all this to say, Bill Burr is right. If you're always blaming other working class people for your economic problems, we're never going to be able to achieve true class solidarity. This is why we're constantly being bombarded with anti-social and anti-poor propaganda, because we're not going to stand a chance in a class war against the billionaires if we're constantly fighting each other. I feel like that's obvious, right? Now, it's another reason why there's been so much anti-left and anti-communist propaganda throughout our country's history, because the left's goal is to unite the working class to take power back from elites. So if you can delegitimize the left and characterize them as extremists and authoritarian, you stop people from connecting the dots if they don't hear that message, and you effectively scare them out of becoming class conscious. That's why there's this effort to demonize the left, and everyone falls for it from time to time, including, unfortunately, Bill Burr, because in this same episode where he talked about the way the ruling class wages class war by scapegoating immigrants, he seemingly didn't grasp how they do the same thing to leftists for the same reason, and he seems to blame the rise of Trump on the left as well. So let's hear him out, and then I'll respond to it.
But this is what happens with extreme behavior. If you look, where was the left 5 years ago when they were doing the theys, and those, and if you didn't use the right pronouns, all of a sudden your fucking career was in jeopardy. They went insane to the left. We leaned so fucking far to the left. So now this has to happen. It went so far left towards the end of the last decade that these psychos on the right think they're in the middle and that they're rational and that they're not the right, the conservative, whatever you want to call it, the right-wing version of what they dealt with from the left, in the late 2000 teens, whatever the fuck you call them. It's insane. And we went flim-flam guy to a guy who should be in a home, back to a flim-flam guy. This is just like the nightmare that keeps giving.
Now, I'm not sure who he's referring to, but needless to say, the left is not responsible for the rise of Donald Trump. Late-stage capitalism always devolves into fascism once liberal democratic institutions become captured by elites. It's inevitable. And while Americans do oscillate back and forth between liberals and fascists every election cycle, that's more a result of them being disillusioned with the establishment and the incumbents who failed to deliver again and again, as things keep getting worse. I mean, think about the disaster that was George W. Bush. Then we had Obama, the polar opposite. But then Obama didn't deliver hope and change that he promised, so Trump went after him. But then Trump didn't make America great again like he promised. Then he bungled the pandemic, so Biden went after him. But Biden let pandemic-era policies expire and broke his campaign promises, so Trump came back with a vengeance. Trump's victory wasn't a reaction to the far left. It was a reaction to the failure of our political establishment. Not to mention, Biden won in 2020 during peak Democratic Party wokeness, after activists were chanting to fund the police in the streets and Democrats were taking a knee in kente cloths. The Democratic Party was blamed for the defund the police rhetoric, and they still won that election. But again, I don't know if he's responding or referring rather to Democrats in particular, maybe Bernie Sanders, maybe AOC. But I mean, AOC, she ran on abolishing ICE in the late 2010s, which is where he kind of singles out. But yet, she's now the most popular Democrat in the country, and she's been thoroughly vindicated on her position on ICE. And I think that even Bill Burr would agree with her, given his statements about ICE being the Gestapo. So I really don't know who he's referring to here, if anyone. Maybe he's just speaking more generally about the left, but I get the sense that he's just kind of throwing the left under the bus for the sake of being fair, but he's unfortunately falling for the thing he's warning us against. Now, I'm not going to discount the blowback that he's referring to from social justice movements, because that really is nothing new, and it doesn't mean that these movements are invalid if people try to resist them. Every civil rights group ever has been demonized, and they've been called radicals and extremists, from the civil rights movement to the gay rights movement. I mean, Americans despised Martin Luther King Jr., and people treated gay men like they had the plague during the AIDS crisis. Today, most Americans would probably think that those movements and the way that they are characterized as extremists was wrong, and it's good that we gave them equal rights, at least to an extent. And now oligarchs, they've just kind of changed the targets and given us new people to hate. Now it's immigrants and trans and non-binary people. But nobody's been fired for not using they, them pronouns. So I'm not sure what he was referring to there. But we have open transphobes like Dave Chappelle and J.K. Rowling with thriving careers to this day. So cancel culture is not really a real thing. It actually was colloquially referred to as political correctness, and now conservatives call it woke culture or woke something, whatever. It's the same game with a different name. They change the name every couple of years once Americans grow tired of their incessant bitching or learn about their real motivations, and then, then it's something new. It is disappointing, I'll admit, to see Bill Burr not extend his analysis of class warfare to the so-called radical left and non-binary people, because this narrative that the left has gone too far is manufactured to sanitize and justify the rising fascism on the right. He didn't create this narrative, so I'm not accusing him of that. I'm just saying this is why the right often refers to the radical left, while the right has gone off the fucking political spectrum. They're becoming increasingly authoritarian in response to material conditions as well as the breakdown of society that's fueled by late-stage capitalism. They are able to seize the moment, and that's why they're shifting to the right, because in times of crisis, people look for a strong man, an authoritarian strong man, and we are not the only fucking country to fall to fascism in recent years, right? India, Hungary, there's a plethora of countries that have gone the same route that we've gone. But demonizing the left is essential to the capitalist cause, because if Americans associate the left with extremism inherently, well, they'll be less likely to even listen to what leftists have to say, which again is very beneficial to capitalists who are doing everything in their power to make sure that Americans never wake up and become class conscious. But I won't be too hard on Bill Burr, because he's 90% of the way there. And so long as he knows that the real common enemy is the super rich cunts, as he put it, he's at least pointing people in the right direction, which is half the battle. So still, what he's doing is really important. And at the end of the day, it's nice to have people like him offer a detailed explanation of class warfare that you really don't get from mainstream media or other podcasts, for that matter. Even if his analysis is still somewhat rudimentary and limited, it's still very good. It goes to show you that people don't have to be experts in political science to know the way that the system is fucking over working class people, right? But it also shows that you kind of have to go the extra step and connect the dots for people, even if they're as savvy as Bill Burr, because not everyone is going to automatically be able to connect all of the dots, which is why we've got to try to do that for them.
Luigi, not happy.